مساء الخير للي ببيروت. Just I hope everyone is able to hear me. Okay.
Hi, Maha.
Hi. Okay, thank you very much for coming today and for attending this one-day seminar on education of refugee children. So the event is to launch the British Academy Bilateral Chair in Education and Conflict, which will be taking place in... Okay. Okay, I hope it's better now. So the British Academy Bilateral Chair is a position where I'll be working between the University of Cambridge and Center for Lebanese Studies at the Lebanese American University. First of all, for those who are not very familiar with the Center for Lebanese Studies, the center was established in 1983 at the University of Oxford, St. Antony's during the Lebanese Civil War. And the idea was for Lebanese actors at that time was to create a space, and it's interesting that many of them were businessmen and bankers, which they've done a very unusual thing in creating a social science research center. But the idea was that we need to invest in research and in social science and humanities with the hope that it would bring about some peace in Lebanon. So the center was based for many years, for over 30 years at Oxford. And then we moved in 2012 to Lebanon, where we have been hosted by the Lebanese American University. One of the, President Michel Maawad will talk more about LAU, but it's one of the most prominent universities in Lebanon. And we chose the university because it provided us with the space to be critical and to explore new avenues with great freedom. So I'm not going to speak for too long. I just want to say a few logistical things. So I'm talking here from Cambridge, and we have an in-person meeting. My colleagues are in Lebanon at the Lebanese American University in person, and we have over 150 people joining us online. There will be live interpretation, so this is why we need to speak a little bit slower than usual. I'll hand over now to Ricardo. Over to you. Thank you.
Is that okay with the camera? Right. Welcome. It is a pleasure to be here. It is a pleasure to have this launch. We have had the opportunity to have Maha and to thank the British Academy for this important award, for providing this funding for this prestigious award, and what an amazing scholar we have here. And we're going to have the opportunity today to listen from other outstanding scholars in the field. My name is Ricardo Sabatesa Isa. I am the Director of Research here at the faculty, and my role today is to chair this event. And I would also like to send my greetings to my colleagues in Lebanon. If you heard my last name is Aisa. So just going back to my Lebanese roots that I have shared with Maha many years ago, I think my great-grandfather left Lebanon, went into the Americas, and then through that route, then I am here today, kind of coming back to Europe and coming closer to my roots closer to Lebanon. So for me, this chair, and it means something also personal, and we had many discussions with Maha both about her scholarship and also about our roots and about the diaspora. So that is also really important. So without any more delays, I would like to introduce our first speaker. So we're going to start. Our first speaker is Mr. James Watts, and I would like to welcome you here. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and hello to all our colleagues in Lebanon. Can you hear me all right? Is that good? Thank you, Ricardo. It's a great privilege for me, sorry, should I sit down? That's better. Should I turn that up a bit? Maybe that's a bit better.
There you go.
Thank you. So once again, thank you. It's very good to be here. It's a great privilege to be able to say a few words on behalf of the Center for Lebanese Studies, which, as you know, is directed by Professor Maha Shuayb. The CLS is an independent academic institution established in 1984 to undertake impartial and balanced research and to contribute to Lebanon's development. And since taking over as director 10 years ago, Maha has transformed what was a small operation into a highly respected regional research institute with an international standing. Based mainly in Beirut, but now with strong ties here in Cambridge, which Maha has recently made her home. The CLS has long focused on education, primarily in the difficult post-conflict environment of Lebanon, and increasingly addressing the needs of the large population of Syrian refugees there. The challenges are huge. The lessons are to be applied to any long-lasting humanitarian emergency anywhere in the world. We're very proud that our mostly Lebanese researchers are bringing vital lessons to the whole world from a country which has suffered greatly and which has survived and continues to yield so much that is positive. I want to pay tribute to Maha personally, as we warmly congratulate her on assuming the British Academy Bilateral Chair in Education in Conflict. It is an outstandingly good appointment. Thank you, British Academy, and thank you also our partners and colleagues here at the Faculty of Education. When she took over, Maha brought a new vision and dynamism to CLS's mission, fulfilling our values by centering that mission on education and social cohesion. The word equitable in the title of our launch, for me, stands out. Education has a moral purpose and a fundamental social role to play. Equity and cohesion are inseparable from it. Maha also brought a firm commitment to policy relevance and to real impact on the delivery of education and on school systems generally, greatly in need of problem solving, of adaptation to increasingly difficult circumstances, and of leadership and hope. Under her direction, CLS has earned the right to be known with all due modesty as an authority in post-conflict education, and Maha's own voice is greatly respected. We look forward to a highly productive partnership with the Faculty of Education here at Cambridge, as well as continuing it with the Lebanese American University in Beirut, whose support and encouragement over the years has been invaluable. I want to end by thanking, on behalf of the board and governors of CLS, not only Maha, but all her colleagues in Beirut and in Cambridge, among them Dr. Catherine Brun, who is with us here today, for the superb work they're continuing to do. I look forward to the day's proceedings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to move us to Beirut, please, and give the word to Dr. Mawad, the president of the Lebanese American University. Dr. Mawad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Sabates. I'm very happy, actually, to co-host this with you for this very important meeting this afternoon here in Beirut. Distinguished organizers, friends, and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I am indeed delighted to be with you today to launch this consequential event. And I am truly gratified to see it happen in person on our LAU campus, where we host, and we're happy and delighted to host the Center for Lebanese Studies. The fact that it's also a hybrid meeting and being simultaneously launched in the UK at Cambridge University as well, speaks to its special importance and particularly its timeliness. The past few years, ladies and gentlemen, at least here in Beirut, can be best described as years of crisis, terrible crisis, intense crisis, multifaceted crisis, far-reaching, and seemingly unrelenting. Its impact can best be assessed through its manifold implications affecting health, affecting lifestyles, economies, affecting behavior, and just about every other aspect of life, unfortunately. Needless to say, education has been impacted to a degree seldom before experienced. We are now in the midst of a disruptive changes that are among the most severe in recorded history, with implications that are yet to be fully comprehended. The truth of the matter is that the world has changed almost beyond our ability to cope, and we have yet to find our way out. Every effort in that direction is worthwhile, and yours is particularly so. You deserve every commendation for being so brave and so forthcoming. Ladies and gentlemen, education, at least here in Lebanon and probably all over the world, is indeed in conflict. Part of the challenge is crisis-induced, and another part is a function of the rapid change the world is undergoing and the inability of educational institutions to keep up with it and adjust quickly enough. The problem in Lebanon is all the more pressing due to the enormity of the economic crisis, the precarious condition of many schools and universities, the existence of educational needs for hundreds of thousands of refugees, literally hundreds of thousands of refugees, Syrians and otherwise, whose right to education should be preserved and respected. And the general air of doom and gloom gripping the country. It is imperative not to lose sight of the needs of refugees as we try to address our own. Dear friends, given the breadth and depth of the educational challenges we are facing, it should be clear that none of us alone can come up with viable answers. Our working together, however, will create the synergy needed to come up with creative solutions for these major problems. This is the special importance of this particular forum and the promise it offers. What you have taken is a bold step to help us navigate uncharted waters and address key issues strategic to our present and future. I can only laud your insight and salute your foresight. In conclusion, I should like to express appreciation to all of you and deep thanks, first and foremost, to Professor Shuayb and to the Cambridge University Faculty of Education. And I wish you great success for this remarkable endeavor. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mawal. We are now going to remain in our online, and it is a pleasure now to invite Judith Herbertson, who is the head of Girls Education Department at FCDO and is very well-known friend for many of us doing research in issues to do with girls' education, and I would like to offer you the floor. Judith, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. My video has been disabled, so if somebody who is hosting the meeting could turn it on, that would be great. Otherwise, I will remain a disembodied voice. I'll start anyway, though. I'll start my video. Lovely. There we go. Your Excellency, distinguished guests, I'm really delighted to join you today for the launch of the British Academy Bilateral Chair in Education in Conflict at Cambridge University. Many thanks first to Professor Sabates Aissa for the introduction, and to both the University of Cambridge and the Centre for Lebanese Studies for inviting me to give this welcome on behalf of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, where, as you've just heard, I head up the Girls' Education Department. And it's a particular pleasure to share this panel with His Excellency Rami Mortada, Lebanon's ambassador to the UK. While the discussion today is focused on the education needs of refugees, we recognise, as Dr. Mawad just said, the entire education system in Lebanon is to some extent now in crisis. And the UK is committed and remains committed to supporting Lebanon to meet the humanitarian needs of both the refugees and also vulnerable Lebanese communities in order to provide quality education for all children. Providing education to children affected by crisis, and particularly those needs of refugees, is vital to our wider education agenda, and particularly to the global objectives that we agreed with the G7 countries and others last year to get 40 million more girls into school and 20 million more reading by the end of primary school, both by 2026, as a staging point on the way to delivering Sustainable Development Goal 4 in 2030. We all know that the scale of the global challenge cannot be underestimated. Earlier this year, analysis from Education Cannot Wait found that 222 million children, imagine what they would look like, currently face disruption to their education due to conflict and crisis. Some 78 million of them are still out of school, and over half of those are girls. And even those in school are often failing to meet minimum levels in reading, writing, and mathematics. And we see these challenges reflected in Lebanon. In 2021, only 56% of the school-aged Syrian children now in Lebanon attended school, and 30% have never attended. This limits their life chances, their opportunities, their choices about their futures. And data from 2021 also indicated that over 737,000 Lebanese, Palestinian, and Syrian children were out of school, some 35% of the school-age population. And learning outcomes still trail behind international standards. You are, of course, not alone in this. There are problems worldwide, particularly facing those badly affected by the pandemic. And as we know, getting those children back into school, ensuring continuity of their learning, and improving teaching to recover the lost learning are all essential to avoid a lost generation and to deliver progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. The UK is proud of its partnership with Lebanon. We have so far allocated over £799 million in humanitarian and development funding since the start of the Syria crisis, when you've so generously hosted so many of those who had to cross the border. This has helped to provide access to education and psychosocial support to some 300,000 children, roughly. And last year, providing financial support to teachers to ensure that schools could reopen and children could start learning again. But globally, you will be acutely aware, we all face many competing crises, as Dr. Mawad was just saying, and with finite resources. And we need to ensure that our investments are supporting the most effective interventions. The lack of strong evidence on what works, where and why limits the impact we can collectively have. And it's for this reason that the FCDO is investing in the bilateral research chairs and the wider Education Research in Conflict and Protracted Crisis, ERIC, programme. So ERIC is a 6-year programme led by the International Rescue Committee that will generate new, rigorous evidence on what works to support education in crisis and support its use by governments and implementing partners on the ground globally. And this wider programme will work closely with the British Academy bilateral research chairs. And I'm very glad to see that the ERIC Research Director, Professor Larry Aber, will be joining for the final panel today. The work of the new bilateral research chair is crucial within this wider programme. Firstly, it will generate rigorous research that can support the FCDO, the Government of Lebanon, and global partners in education in emergencies to design more effective programmes and provide support to crisis-affected education systems. And secondly, it will help foster a new generation of researchers, widening the pool of those working on these issues and bringing in new perspectives from crises and conflicts that have been peripheral for too long. We're very pleased, therefore, to welcome Dr. Maha Shuayb to this new role. Many congratulations, and we look forward to working with her and her colleagues in Cambridge and in Beirut. So welcome again to all of you, and my thanks to the organisers for this opportunity to address you. While I'm unfortunately only able to stay for a short while longer, I'm pleased that Camilla Nicholas, our Development Director in Lebanon, and Manisha Bhatt, our Humanitarian Policy and Programme Manager, are with you there in Beirut. And in Cambridge, you're joined by Shane McLaughlin and Salim Salama from the FCDO Education, Gender and Inclusion Research Team. I shall very much look forward to hearing more about the work of the Research Chair soon and returning to these issues with all of you in years to come as our knowledge and experience grow. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thank you for all our colleagues and all the support that FCDO has given to these different programs. And now, just to close this session, we have the words that are going to be given to us by His Excellency, the Ambassador Murtada, Ambassador of the Lebanon to the UK. The floor is yours.
Good morning, and sorry for being late coming from London. I wish to thank the Center for Lebanese Studies at the Lebanese American University, Dr. Shuayb, for inviting me to reflect on such an important topic as education and conflict, showcasing refugee education in Lebanon and trying to draw lessons that could serve this industry across the globe. It is also great to be at the University of Cambridge, a beacon of, obviously, of global knowledge and excellence, and to be remotely tuned to another great university in Lebanon and the region, the Lebanese American University. Let me start by emphasizing that our effort today is not a mere academic or intellectual effort. It's for millions around the universe, a life-saving and life-changing necessity. Today, millions of children across the globe have never seen a teacher as a result of armed conflict. While conflict and fragility lead to poor access to education on its term then further fragilizes societies and increases the risk of conflicts, thus throwing any country into a vicious cycle of underdevelopment, poverty, crime, and violence. All this is obviously further exacerbated in a context of displacement or refugee crisis. Refugees are vulnerable groups whose access to basic rights, including education, is a right and a need for global peace that needs to be guaranteed. Today, more than half of the world's refugee children do not attend school, with all the ensuing complications like forced recruitment into armed conflicts, child labor, sexual exploitation, and child marriage. And the current global uncertainties resulting from wars, economic fragility, inflation, and increase in energy and cost of living prices, education for vulnerable groups should not become a collateral damage. Donors are particularly invited to maintain and rather increase their development assistance. This assistance, which is currently witnessing a preoccupying downturn. Barriers to refugee education are numerous: mental health, the traumatic situation of refugee families, delays in accessing education, administrative hurdles, lack of funding, etc., etc. Lebanon is no exception to this challenge. A country hosting refugees amounting to more than 1/3 of its population and witnessing a severe and crippling economic crisis described by the World Bank recently as one of the 3 worst crises since the 19th century. Lebanon is struggling to meet the needs of Syrian refugees, particularly in education. While education for refugees is a basic right that should not be held hostage to the larger dynamics of a refugee crisis, we also cannot overlook the overall picture. The general context and environment of the Syrian refugee crisis looks very gloomy. International divisions around the Syrian conflict, donors' fatigue already being felt, stagnation in the conflict resolution and stabilization efforts inside Syria, G7 countries failing to lead by example on refugees as their anti-immigration policies are on the rise, difficult political dynamics inside Lebanon, including on and around the Syrian refugee crisis. Education is about providing a sustainable future for children. This same sustainable future that is jeopardized by the absence for the 11th year of any visibility as to the prospects and workable solutions to the plight of refugees, of Syrian refugees. Asylum is by definition a temporary status pending a permanent settlement that guarantees a stable and foreseeable future. And humanitarian assistance is designed to deal with an emergency, not with a protracted crisis that has been going on unabated for 11 years, with no solution in sight. Today, 11 years into the crisis, the transition in the strategic outlook of international efforts towards the Syrian refugee crisis has not yet managed to move us from a humanitarian logic towards an approach that provides openings towards a more sustainable and bearable path for all the stakeholders in the asylum cycle. Integration in Lebanon is by all means not a viable option. You have the social fabric of the country, the mass influx, the numbers, the very fragile political system and structure, and the need to maintain, most importantly, the need to maintain the integrity of the Syrian social fabric. These are unsurmountable elements that make integration as a long-term solution impossible. The other long-term solution in theory is resettlement, which also remains symbolic, and we are all seeing the trends of anti-migrant policies, which I think will be further exacerbated by the current economic fragility in countries that traditionally have resettlement openings for refugees. Repatriation, which is the third long-term solution, repatriation remains controversial and subject, of course, to conditions of safety and security inside Syria, but also subject to the economic conditions inside Syria, which should be continuously assessed and reviewed with the hope for some openings. In general, Syria should not become a forgotten conflict, and policies should not continue to be stagnant and resistant to any update or refreshment. Meanwhile, Lebanon will continue to uphold the principle of non-refoulement and will continue to shoulder its responsibilities, particularly in refugee education. We are investing in the future of a neighboring country and therefore in our sustainable national security. Today, our public schools and infrastructure, originally designed to accommodate 200,000 students, is tasked with accommodating more than 500,000. The government of Lebanon is, as you know, enrolling refugees in public schools using a two-shift system, with an afternoon shift specifically for refugee and non-Lebanese children. However, the economic crisis added to the problem, with children previously enrolled in private schools being now moved to the state system, thus increasing the burden on state schools. Deteriorating living conditions across the country, fading international assistance, along with, as I said, the absence of long-term perspectives for a solution, remain major sources of concern for both refugees and their host communities and the host country. However, Lebanon is keen not to miss the opportunity to be at the forefront of shouldering responsibilities, particularly when they relate to life-changing needs like refugee education. And we will be looking forward for the rest of the discussions in today's event, and I thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And now I would like to pass to my next chair, Jeff. So we're moving to the second session, and it will be chaired by Jeff. And yes.
Good morning to everybody around the world who's attending this very important conference. Today's panel is titled Critical Reflections on the Field of Education in Conflict. I have the great privilege of chairing this panel. My name is Jeff Crisp. I'm affiliated to the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford and Chatham House in London, and spent most of my career working with UNHCR. Let me quickly introduce our very distinguished panel. If you want to see the full bios, I'd refer you to the conference programme, and in the interest of time, let me quickly run through the speakers. We have Maha from the Centre of Lebanese Studies in Cambridge University, who's already well known to you. Mario Novelli from the Faculty of Education, University of Sussex. Rita Giacaman, joining us online from Birzeit University. Ahmad Swaid from the Janine High School, Lebanon. And our discussant this morning will be Elaine Unterhalter from the Education Faculty at the University College of London. We have 75 minutes for this session and 5 speakers, so I would ask all of them to be rather brief in their comments, maybe 10 to 12 minutes. If we can keep to that schedule, we'll still have time for some questions and comments. Before turning to our distinguished panel, Maha has very kindly asked me to put today's workshop in some kind of historical perspective. So let me just for 3 or 4 minutes say a few words about that. My own interest in refugee education developed in the years after 1999, when I was undertaking a series of evaluations of UNHCR's country operations and also working on global policy issues of concern to UNHCR. And in the course of those evaluations and policy work, we came to a number of conclusions. Firstly, within UNHCR, there was a serious lack of sustained support for the refugee education function. Every few years, UNHCR would launch a special initiative on refugee education, but those initiatives were never really systematically followed up, and they were certainly not backed up by the allocation of financial or human resources. In fact, there were very few education specialists within UNHCR, and they tend to have very low prestige within the organisation. Functions such as security, logistics, emergency response and protection were perceived to be quite important and even sexy, whereas education officers were seen as a rather second-class person of employee in the organisation. Secondly, at that time, UNHCR's assessment of refugee education programmes was very crude and very much based on quantitative measurements. The organisation knew a lot about how many boys and girls were registered for school, how many boys and girls actually attended school, and what the pupil-teacher ratios were. But there was very little attention given to the quality of education, to whether children were actually learning anything useful for their future lives, and whether schools were safe spaces for the children attending them. Our third conclusion was that there was a very great and disproportionate preoccupation with primary enrolment. Around the world, there were some very intermittent vocational training programs for older refugees, and of course we had the long-established DAFI program, the scholarship program for refugees around the world. But in general, UNHCR had a very low level of ambition for refugee youth generally. And then a final conclusion from the evaluations we undertook in that time was that there was a predominant focus on education in refugee camps, despite a growing evidence that refugees were increasingly moving out of camps or avoiding camps altogether and taking up residence in urban areas or settling with host communities. And this, of course, has been very much distinguishing feature of the refugee situation in Lebanon, where there are no camps. But UNHCR's education programs at that time were very much focused on refugee camps. And as a result of those 4 concerns and a number of other concerns, in 2011 we commissioned a team, an evaluation team, led by Sarah Dryden-Peterson of Harvard University, to undertake a comprehensive and global review of refugee education. It's an excellent piece of work. It's still available online on the web, and it was very critical of its findings. It's a long and detailed report, but if I could just give you a flavour of it, the overall conclusion of that evaluation was as follows. Education, it says, is one of the highest priorities of refugee communities, yet there is very little evidence of tangible organisational commitment by UNHCR to guaranteeing the right to education for refugee children and young people. Now, I retired from UNHCR a year or 2 after those words were written, and one of my interests in coming to this workshop today is to see what kind of progress has been made in the education sector since that evaluation was undertaken. And in that respect, I was very pleased to receive just a couple of weeks ago a new book by Sarah Dryden-Peterson, who undertook the evaluation for us 10 years ago, a new book called Right Where We Belong: How Refugee Teachers and Students Are Changing the Future of Education. Now, I haven't finished reading the book myself, but overall I'm pleased to say the general tone of the book is significantly more optimistic and positive than the evaluation that Sarah undertook in 2011. And if I can just give you a little flavour of the book, The very final words of it are as follows: season after season and year after year, refugee young people and their teachers persist together as they seek to build the kind of learning that can enable more peaceful and equitable futures for us all. And I'm sure that this project will certainly contribute to the achievement of that objective. So I'm now going to turn to the panel to ask them to offer some further reflections on this important issue, and perhaps to give us some indication of what progress we have been making in this area over the past few years. So our first speaker is Maha. So Maha, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Which one? We have to go to the first slide, sorry. Yes, that's it, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff. I will be giving a brief summary of what happened over the past 20 years since the publication of that report. Okay, let me just make sure. Okay, so in this presentation, I hope you can all hear me well, and I'm sorry you can't see me, probably those who are on the other side. But what I'll be focusing on, two things. I'll be focusing on how this field obviously field has flourished since Jeff, you started. You will see that there has been a real huge increase in what has been published and the investment in education. I'll be focusing on two things: how the discourse has evolved over the past 20 years, but who is shaping this discourse and who's contributing? Because then understanding how it was the kind of language it took on, it would make sense because of the different participants who are leading and dominating the discourse. So it has, how do we know that it has really, really grown a lot? Now education, from that report, now UNHCR considered education as part of any humanitarian response. It is in the Global Compact on Refugees. There's a commitment to education, so it's no longer something that is ad hoc, that is done depending on someone's willingness to do that. Is part of the policy. And this attention has, as a result, been reflected in the numbers. If you look at 2000, the enrollment rate in primary education has really increased significantly. Jeff, as you rightly said, what happened later on after primary is still an issue. We see in tertiary education we have less than 1%, and in secondary the rates are still very low. Spending and expenditure on education of refugee has also increased. The World Bank estimates that 4.85 billion are invested on education on refugees worldwide in the global north and south. In humanitarian funding, also the funding has increased from 10 billion to 554 million. Now, the World Bank estimates, I'm not sure how the methodology, I haven't really gone deep into it, but that would need at least 8 billion pounds to fill the gap that we need for the cost of education of refugees. This has also been reflected on research. If we look at what has been published on research, if we just go into JSTOR, so the forced migration has been already an well-established field. We see how there's sudden increase in research and publications on education of refugee children. Now, what also we see, interestingly, and this is probably the impact of the humanitarian discourse dominating what's been happening, is the increase in number of reports. Many reports are being featured and are shaping the discourse on education. Reports from humanitarian agencies, but also international NGOs. okay, who is contributing to this increase? So having been studying this field for over 15 years now, the UN agencies have obviously contributed a lot to this discussion, and they often collaborate with academics who interchangeably use the consultancy hat. So we have a research that is being carried out very close to policy, and I think this has an impact on what kind of critique you can be, you can give when your basically employer is the one drawing the agenda. We do see humanitarian networks such as INI influencing a lot the discourse, and the humanitarian network is basically funded and supported by humanitarian agencies. The committee, to be a member, a voting, an active member of the committee, you have to pay $10,000, and the members are UN agencies and large INGOs. States, whether funders or hosts, are also playing a very big role, as we will see, in deciding, is it a good idea to invest in nation-state systems or not? Because the global north states are the ones who fund, and the global south states are the ones who receive the funding. What we find missing from this debate, and I think the fact that it's a humanitarian-led debate, so it claims to be apolitical and neutral. So the whole discourse is very apolitical. We don't know why these agendas and policies are being, what's the motivation? So one big motivation, as the ambassador said, is there's a growing xenophobia in the global north. We don't want refugees to come to the global north. And education is also a very good way of stabilizing them, but all the population, but also it's a very good PR investment as well. You don't want to see children on the street. You don't want to see these pictures in the newspapers. So it's important that we also keep our electoral population very happy by investing in education. We are helping these students in the global north, south. But the agendas of the hosting states are also not to be forgotten. I mean, in Lebanon, if you follow the discourse of our politicians, who are also quite xenophobic and anti-refugees, the same minister who was heading the Ministry of Education, who was very well known for being anti-refugee when he was a member of the municipality, he said, we want education of refugee children, and we want to provide it in our national educational system. And he was telling the teachers it's a good source of income for you to supply your salaries. Now, who we find missing are refugees. They're not part of this conversation. And that's as I will show what kind of discourse it presented. So what we see is most of the discourse is generated in the global north. It's about the global south, and the solutions are for the global south. What is really interesting is in the UNHCR strategies, even for 2030, you would think that there are no refugees in the global north. You think all of them are in the global south, and we're just concerned with this population. If we look at GCRF funds, which has been a big fund, at least in this country, Lebanon has been named as the country of focus for 17 of these grants. Only one researcher headed these grants. All of the other researcher studies were headed by scholars in the global north, leading the study and conducting it in Lebanon. If we look at authorship, who's publishing, again, this is a study done by our colleagues in Carleton University, and 86% of knowledge about the topic is produced by scholars in the global north. And even when they want to co-author together, they co-author together. So they're doing the research projects on the global north. The collaboration, the co-PIs are not even from the region. They are from regions within their institutions. So it's a discourse dominated by the global north, again. So what do we see as a result of this? There has been a growing reification of refugees. I remember the first time I started thinking about this field, and I was talking to a colleague of mine here in Cambridge. And, do we need education of refugee children? Is it different from the education of any other disadvantaged group? And somehow now it's taken for granted that they are so unique. They're so traumatized, they're so damaged that they need special provisions. And I think we have to really take this very carefully. Is it really that, because they're labeled in a way that they're stuck in this humanitarian umbrella. They cannot be integrated long term. They are very, their research is very unique and their discourse is very unique. Even scholars who have worked and published a lot on education of migrant children have also adopted uncritically this premises that they are so unique that we cannot use any literature. I think one of the things that we have in this country is we have a lot of literature on inequality in education. If you look at UNHCR list of references in many of their publications, they would never feature a publication on inequality in education anywhere around the world. It's only literature that is produced about refugees in the global south. So all the debate about inequality in education or what works or language provisions for bilingual or etc. is completely, we've started with a blank canvas and we're just recreating a whole new discourse. This has culminated in the creation of education in emergency, which is now the common framework that we use to talk about education of refugee. And I think it's very interesting that it's emergency, although education is a long term. It's anything but emergency. It's a very long process that you really carefully plan and you really are obsessing about what happens at the end of it. But here it's all about providing access to education. And education, there's rare discussion about the long-term objectives of education. And this is why increasingly we see this drift between the discourse, practice, and research on education and migrant children. And even this research is also disconnected between global north and south. And that's a very interesting thing. So now you see research on refugees in the global north that doesn't talk about or discuss refugees in the global south, and vice versa. So there are these scholars operating separately here and here. In the global south, it's a humanitarian discourse. In the global north, it's about integration, it's about long-term objectives, but there we're talking about, it's a very different discourse. And the question is it really an artificial distinction that we're doing? The old colonial, migration, forced migration is very well known for being a very colonial field. Unfortunately, this has been reproduced again in education of refugee children. The way the solutions are designed, who's conducting the research, how this research is being carried out, is reproducing the same colonial structures as we've had and as I've showed in the research findings. I think this apolitical, sorry, there's the dash here that's forgotten. The apolitical language and rhetoric of education is really amazing. In this country, we often, parties kill each other about educational policies, right? And when we have a change of government between Labour and Tories, we have a big debate and everything has to be changed and rewritten about education. It's a very political process. But in context of refugees, the political agendas of the host states or the donor state are completely silenced. There is nothing. It's operating, the whole provision is operating in a bubble, in a very neutral bubble. As if the education is about a classroom. It's a chair and a board, and that's it. It's nothing more than that. But we know, at least from the Afghani experience of Afghani refugees and the way the donor funding has influenced the kind of textbooks, what was included in these textbooks, and Mario, you've written on this. It's a very political process on all levels. Okay, I'm going to, so if we look at now the humanitarian discourse on education of refugees, if we trace it from the early documents of 1997, there wasn't a big ambition at that time. The ambition was that if we provide children with education, it's good for their psychological well-being, it's good for their mental health, it's kind of normal, something normal in their life. And there was a lot of non-formal education, but suddenly we should see a huge shift into formal, standardized, accredited education. And who's going to provide this? It's the nation state of the host country. And then a lot of money is given to the nation states, and these children are integrated into the educational systems of the nation states. But this is without any consequences. Many of these refugees will never have any of the rights or privileges that come out of education. Employment, mobility, social status, they will always be stuck. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are denied the right to work. They study, but we know that they are one of the groups who perform the least in terms of education because there's no prospect for this education. Again, all of this, we have completely turned a blind eye. And as a result, education is treated as unmitigated good. It's very good to have education, but why and for what? It's never problematized. We're not saying that it's not good, but I'm saying is there must be something beyond literacy here that we can also achieve. So there's hardly any discussion about the future outcomes of education, and access continues to be the main driver of the discourse. I want to problematize the issue of why do I think we need to really think about this new idea of standardized education in the host country. So there is one issue, is many of these refugees don't have any legal rights in these countries. So they are in the educational system of this country, suffering double coercion, the coercion of having to learn often in a language that is not theirs. They don't have any rights out of this education. They will not be able to do anything. They would often have many bureaucratic challenges for their education, like even going to higher education, or even in Lebanon, once you turn 15, you need a residency, which more than 80% of refugees don't have residency to even continue their secondary education. As a result, you're basically teaching them literacy. It's a literacy education, that's at best. So all of the things that come as a result of education, I mean, we all want our children to have equal opportunities to everything, to their futures, to their dreams. I mean, we will see later, Ahmad will talk about his experience, but at the moment, this is not, well, you know, there are no prospect for the current educational system if we don't address the political issues of including refugees in the nation state. This is why I feel it's quite naive and a tokenistic vision of education. And there's also a longer term issue, as many of these countries refuse that the refugee teachers teach students. And as a result, and most of these conflicts are protracted, you have refugee teachers who never are able to practice. If ever they would go home, they've been totally de-skilled, and we're not looking, they're not being developed. So if we take Lebanon as a case study, we have 1 million students, Lebanese students. We have 200,000 who go to state schools. The vast majority go to private schools because of they perceive that the quality of education is bad. Suddenly, the national educational system had to absorb 500,000 new students in a system that has a capacity of 200,000. It's a huge endeavor for any strong state, let alone a state like Lebanon. But again, the decision by the humanitarian agencies and the Lebanese government is to only provide education, formal education, for Syrian refugees in the national educational system. Non-formal programs were shut down and were not allowed to operate until much later. So they have to learn the Lebanese national curriculum, which already was disadvantaging the disadvantaged Lebanese who don't speak English. They have to learn subjects in English or French. So now the Syrian refugees have not only to inherit our inequality and weak system, but also, even if they manage to make it somehow, they won't have any future in Lebanon. But the good news is they will have a certified schooling. Now let's see 10 years on what happens. So at best, we think that 50% of refugees were able to enroll in education, informal and in some informal program. Many of the children drop out. At the moment, after 10 years, 2% are currently enrolled in grade 9. So we're talking about 200 students out of 500,000 students who after 10 years managed to stay in the system. The vast majority, 50%, never saw education because the program only provides for 50%. I remember asking the head of UNHCR for education, I said, what will you do with the other 50? Why don't you provide like private schooling or any other non-formal? She said, we can't, because the state said we're the only provider here, so there's no other provider. And this is the kind of deals that I'm talking about, the kind of compromises that you have to take in these contexts. And during COVID, refugee children were the first group to be thrown out of the system that is already weak. I mean, already Lebanese children are hardly attending school now. So I'm aware of time, so I'm going to be speeding. So I wanted to quickly go through, so do we need to promote this national framework of education that refugees would be hosted in national education system of the host states? Or there's another discourse that says we should have global frameworks. Why do rich students can do IB, the International Baccalaureate, that they can travel around the world and do it, but poor refugee children can't do that? So if we look at some of the potentials of the national frameworks, that yes, it strengthens supposedly the local system. It can give them accreditation. It involves the local community. It respects the local context. Integration is questionable because in Lebanon, refugee children study in segregated shifts in the afternoon, and the same in Jordan. Supposedly, they would have a better access to employment if the legal framework allows them to do that. In the case of Lebanon, it doesn't. Limitations is that you are inheriting a system that God knows what you have in it. Lots of inequality, lots of poverty, lots of nepotism and corruption and etc. that you have to deal with it. And obviously, as a humanitarian agency, you cannot deal with all of this. There's the issue of cost, the actual ability to develop the capacity of the local system, and the potential poor outcomes and acculturation as well. With the global framework, you can have an international, very general framework that could be adapted and contextualized, some people would argue. I mean, even the French baccalaureate, known to be one of the most rigid baccalaureate system, is now trying to at least teach the Algerian Revolution, which is quite a shift. So, I mean, some of these global frameworks are trying to be more, less decontextualized. You don't have to inherit a system of inequalities. You can develop the framework as you want, and you don't have to have any political issues with the nation state if they allow us to do that. And there's an issue of accreditation as well, and you can involve the refugee in the teaching. But the issue is you have segregation, obviously, because it's a separate system that you have to deal with it, and you're creating a parallel system and emphasizing exceptionalism, and it could widen inequalities. And there's a cost, and you don't know how much we can contextualize this. It just these two, I wanted to provide this so we can think about what could be possible. I think in all cases, there are things that we need to be aware of, and we have a lot of data that we already know a lot. We don't have to recreate everything. We know on a micro and meso levels, on a school level, that teaching and learning is very similar. I mean, every classroom is different. I mean, all of us who teach, every year we change our classroom. So in a context, I remember when I asked teachers, do you change? She said, what do you mean? I said, you have refugees now. She said, every year I change. So on a classroom level, I mean, my son is supposedly, he's actually British, but he moved here. He had to, I was thinking, like, how different is he from a refugee besides his background? He had to go through a huge difficulty getting accustomed to the system, which is any child has to do. So on a micro and meso level, there are lots of similarities between a long-term settlement and a short-term settlement. So if you have a legal status, regardless what it is, in a classroom, teaching and learning, you have the same challenges. So that is the priority. We need to look at the legal structure. So if you involve the nation state as your education framework, we have to see what rights does the state give. We have to look at to what extent there's equality within the system. Do children have access to all possibilities, or is it only primary education? Or in Germany, you might have access to school, but automatically you're pushed into the lower end of vocational education. The parents haven't even been told that there's an academic route that their children could go to. We need short-term induction or introduction classes, because the sudden emergence of refugees into mainstream schooling, like it happened in Lebanon, they've been out of school. We have a longitudinal study following a cohort of refugees in Lebanon, Turkey, and Australia. On average, refugees had spent 2 to 3 years out of school. Suddenly, they're back into a classroom in Lebanon, sudden immersion with no support. They didn't even get any language support. So imagine they are in a classroom. They've been already demoted by 5 years because they don't speak English. The fact, if you're in grade 10 or grade 4 and you don't know the English alphabet, you still can't learn. But amazingly, there was no language support in Lebanon. There wasn't even any initial English or French education classes. And the idea is just get them in the school. I remember our Minister of Education, he said, it's better than having them on the streets. And I always think, like, why should it be the street or a very poor learning environment? So continuous language support, also what we know from Sweden, for instance, versus Germany, is that they have continuous learning support. It doesn't happen only in the induction. And this is like in Australia, our cohort, they have it only in the first year, and then there's no support. And as a result, they're doing much worse than even the Lebanese and our Turkish population. Open and second chances for adult education. Many of the educational systems are exclusive. If you miss at any point and you leave, it's very difficult to come back. So we know that these are issues, and we know what works. Early years, often an issue that is under invested in by humanitarian education. It's the key for any. If you miss early years, it takes a child 8 years to make up for what he missed in early years. And I think with COVID now, it's remarkably, I mean, this data is even interesting for us here in COVID in this country. So in the research, I think we need to be very careful about what knowledge we are producing. And I think within the current research system and climate, the knowledge we are producing and the discourse is very skewed to certain agendas and certain discourses, the humanitarian one. And how do we produce it? I mean, we talk a lot about research ethics, and tomorrow we have a workshop on research ethics. But one of the big issues and questions in research ethics is partnerships. To what extent are these partnerships ethical? And to what extent this knowledge that we are producing, we're using it and publishing it in an ethical way? We need to question our positionality, and I feel in the field of education of refugee children, there's very little problematization of who we are, where we are. Do we even know the language of the context we're studying, etc.? And we need to problematize the policy near research, which is very predominant in this field. And we need to push back against exclusionary networks. This is the other thing, is now these colonial power dynamics are not only in research. We have them in our networks. You know, if you look at INI, it's one of the, it's a network based in the global north in New York, about the global south. You can be a member of the small committees, that's perfect. You can be from the global south. But you can't be a decision maker. We need to talk about equality and equal partnerships, and I think this chair, what it's trying to do, and I was talking to Sean, and I thought it was very refreshing to see the FCDO and BA trying to push the discourse of equitable research partnerships. It's a bilateral chair that had to be equally in these two contexts, and this is why in the launch we wanted to make sure that it's in both contexts it's happening, and the people on the other side can even understand what we're saying. Many of the events we attend are not even, we don't have interpretation. Revisit funding policies. Many of the funding grants don't even allow you, like I remember ESRC, would not allow you to do a comparative study between Lebanon and England. You can't. The eligibility criteria just doesn't allow you to do this. So the kind of knowledge we are producing is, what kind of knowledge? Are you telling me that the global north and south are incomparable? But also you can't be a PI if you are based in a global south institution. You always have to find someone kind you can trust who would be your, PI. So in this chair, and I spoke for too long, but I'm trying, this is why I highlighted in my program policy research, because I want to understand how is the discourse unraveling, who's doing it, how do we push beyond this a humanitarian discourse, which is in some ways oxymoron to education, because education is all about the future and humanitarianism is all about the present and the moment and saving lives. How do we do equitable partnerships and we do this knowledge exchange? And finally, we want to experiment by creating this space where we have research, policy, practice, and see, can we have a conversation amongst the three in the same room, and what kind of knowledge we could produce if we work together in the same room. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Maha, for that very valuable and comprehensive overview of the current state of refugee education and research on refugee education. I'd now like to invite our next speaker to take the floor, Mario from University of Sussex. If I could remind all of our subsequent speakers to try and keep your comments to 10 or 12 minutes in order to respect the timetable for today's event. Thank you.
It's okay. It's your show.
Stand if that's okay.
Which PowerPoint is it?
Novelli. Yeah, perfect. How do I move forward? Just click it.
Yeah, with the arrows.
You can just cut me off. Cut me off after 10 minutes.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks very much for the invitation to talk today. And it's really a great privilege to be part of Maha's journey and the BA chair, which really speaks to many of the issues that that myself, as somebody that's been in and out of academia and practitioner, working with different agencies, as well as doing research over the last 20 years on the relationship between education and conflict. And many of the issues that I'll talk about today, which really explore the evolution and the history of the field of education in emergencies, and talk about, what on the one hand is a very positive story of the international community coming together and recognizing the particularity and the importance of the relationship between education and conflict, but also recognizing the uneven geographies of intervention, of morality, of who counts and who doesn't count within this field, and reflecting on some of those dimensions. And, I feel like listening to the introductions today, and also to Maha's, there's a very sober atmosphere, I think, that we all carry. A recognition that we're in times of transition, that outlooks are not looking good economically, politically. There is a lot of tension in the world, and this field itself is an extreme field, looking at the relationship between education and conflict. So although we're talking about what is a subfield within a broader area of international development, I think the insights for that around inequalities and power are relevant beyond our own particular field. Now, I want to begin looking at the orthodox view of the evolution of the field of education in emergencies. This map and timeline is taken from a report from 2013 written by, coming out of the Brookings Institute in Washington, influential think tank, which explores the evolution of the field of education in emergencies. And it tells a story, a fairly upbeat story, of a quite fragmented response to refugee education, to conflict in different parts of the world, emerging out of the Second World War, where UNHCR and other agencies are operating in refugee camps and trying to understand what to do with education, particularly with refugees. And as we move on, we see a broader engagement with relationships between education, war, peace, issues around children, children's rights, children as victims of conflict. But the general story is told that there is a scattering, a proliferation of activities, but uncoordinated, which post-1990, end of Cold War, starts to become a consolidation. The creation of the Interagency Network on Education in Emergencies, which brings together many of the major donors and international actors, where, in a sense, the education sector recognises the importance of this education-conflict relationship and starts to develop a range of strategies, tools, toolkits to deal with that. And then the third phase, the phase of collaboration, is where an emboldened education sector has now the courage, the intellectual courage and practitioner knowledge to then go back and engage with the broader fields, the security sector, the humanitarian sector, and say, this is us, and we want to broadly engage with you. So it's a generally upbeat history of, in a sense, an evolving practice of education in emergencies. And there is a truth in this. I'm not denying this truth. And then above those three categories, you'll see a range of declarations and a range of meetings, in a sense, that lead to those steps. The creation of INEE, the formation, certain types of reports that had particular impact and galvanized the international community. And as it moves on, and this ends 2013, but we could move on, and the story would be told that lessons are learned, we understand what works, and we move forward, and it's a sense of progress. And then beneath, at the bottom there, you have a range of conflicts. And I think that the table itself reflects the way that the West understands the world. The international community sits on top. It meets in New York and Washington and Geneva, and it looks down at those conflicts that are going on in messy places, and the neutral West intervenes in those places, intervenes and tries. It's not directly part of those issues, and it's trying to do its best within the limits of its capacity to act. And that's a story that's told, I think, of general progress, general optimism, and the general benevolence of the West. And what I would say is, as academics, we have to kind of look between the lines of those things. Ask what Boaventura de Sousa Santos, well-known sociology, would say, is the sociology of absences. What's missing from that story? And start to try and tell that. And I think that when you look at our field and start to then try to tell the story, you'll realise that there is a selective humanity within this intervention. The field really starts galvanising itself post-1990 up to the early 2000s. And the reason really where education and conflict starts to matter is because in 1990 the international community set as its target in the Education for All conference in Jomtien in 1990, a commitment to gender equality and out-of-school education populations around the world. And 10 years after those big international declarations and commitments, we discover that half of all kids out of school exist in conflict-affected contexts. So there was an urgency that if we're going to meet these targets that we've committed to, that suddenly conflicts matter to us. They matter to us because of these targets. That leads to the creation of the INEE, and we move forward. Other big events that happen in this period, we have the end of the Cold War, and we have changes in the Security Council, particularly in relation to the vetoes, and we have the emergence of humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention becomes very important for this field because the UN breaks its paralysis and starts to intervene not in all conflicts, but in conflicts that they decide where the state has not taken responsibility for its commitment to the human rights of its own populations, and therefore the West can intervene. In that process of humanitarian intervention, it means that conflict and education are no longer circulating on the outskirts of the conflict in refugee camps in those areas, but actually inside, because Western intervention goes in, and with that Western intervention follows all of the social sectors, etc., inside the conflicts. This is when we discover internally displaced people, which we didn't count before. So we have the question, the phenomenon of IDPs, all of these things emerge during that period. So we have a shift then, which requires more personnel and a growth in the broader field. Post 9/11 is another big milestone. Post 9/11 and the war on terror really affects the geography and the history of emergence of this field. Resources focus particularly on Islamic states, whether it be Afghanistan or Iraq initially, or more broadly during that period. So there is a selective focus on these areas and a particular focus on issues around tensions between Islamic education versus secular education, girls' education, issues around madrasas, a whole range of interests that are undergirded by geopolitics. So the evolution of the field, looking at it through that lens, is not as linear and based on humanitarian good sense and what works, but geopolitical interests and geopolitical conflicts. And so that leads me to ask the question of worthy and unworthy victims. Judith Butler talks about this and says that one way of posing the question of who we are in these times of war is by asking whose lives are considered valuable, whose lives are mourned, and whose lives are considered ungrievable. We might think of war as dividing population into those who are grievable and those who are not. An ungrievable life is one that cannot be mourned because they've never lived. That is, it has never counted as a life at all. We can see the division of the globe into grievable and ungrievable lives from the perspective of those who wage war in order to defend the lives of certain communities and to defend them against the lives of others, even if it means taking those latter lives. Now, what that leads us to reflect on is who has the right to be grieved? Who has the right to be concerned about? Which refugees do we care about? Which conflicts are important? And the problem is the international community is selectively highly hypocritical in these processes. We care about Ukrainian refugees. We don't care about Syrian refugees at this current conjuncture. We continually move on from one conflict to the next conflict, rewriting the history that we choose. And education is absolutely rooted in many of those areas. I won't talk about the research, but the research mirrors many of those issues that I'm talking about. And just to kind of finish, it's not only about the geography of humanitarian intervention and its unevenness, it's also about the way education can be used and weaponized in the pursuit of broader other issues. And I would argue that the way that gender has been used in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades has been part of the legitimation for the invasion and occupation. 176,000 people died during that war, and I think that the justification that it was about girls was mobilized. We know there were other reasons, but girls' education was used there. And just to finish and quote Jeffrey Sachs' report, he did an analysis of the money that was spent by the US in Afghanistan. And I just want to finish with reading this, if you'll allow me. According to a recent report by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, the US invested roughly $946 billion between 2001 and 2021. Yet almost $1 trillion in outlays won the US few hearts and minds. And here is why. Of the $946 billion, fully $816 billion, or 86%, went to military outlays for US troops. And the Afghan people saw little of the remaining $130 billion, with $83 billion going to the Afghan security forces. Another $10 billion or so was spent on drug interdiction operations, while $15 billion was for US agencies operating in Afghanistan. That left a meager $21 billion for economic support funding. Yet even much of this spending left little, if any, development on the ground, because the programs actually supported counter-terrorism, bolstering national economies, and assist in the development of effective, accessible, and independent legal systems. Education spending, out of that, constituted 0.18% of the overall spending. Now, I think the discursive role of education for girls way outweighed the material investment in education for girls. And therefore, our sector was caught up in doing a very nice job in whitewashing other things that were happening. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Mario. That was a very stimulating presentation. Our next speaker is Rita at Birzeit University. You'll set it up. Thank you.
You're muted, Rita.
Okay, now it's much better. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. Thank you, Maha, for inviting me to be part of this. And many thanks in relation to especially the issue of spending, which is so typical of Palestine, something like 35% of international aid expenditure or the Palestinian Authority money, it says here unmute. I don't want to, I stay muted. Okay, goes to security. The security of whom we don't know. I think it's the security of Israel, certainly not the security of Palestinians. In any case, I will be speaking very quickly about. I'd like to share screen, please.
There you go.
Yes, thank you very much. Very quickly, I think I have only 10 minutes or so. I would like to speak about Palestine, refugees, colonization, decolonization, all of that in 10 minutes. This is Palestine, historic Palestine, stuck between Transjordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Historic Palestine in 1917 was all of that area in yellow. In 1917, for some reason, the British government decided with the Balfour Declaration to give this land, the Palestinian land, which it did not own, to people coming from elsewhere based on the idea of a land without people for a people without land. But we were always there as Palestinians for many, many, many centuries before that. It was quite a drama, which I still don't understand until now. And I keep being told that this was the colonial mentality. In any case, in 1948, the United Nations endorsed the partition of Palestine into what is now known as Israel, and with the remaining West Bank and Gaza Strip inhabited by Palestinians and forcibly annexed to Jordan. 2/3 of the Palestinian population became refugees at the time, and since that time, we still have about a bit more than 5 million Palestinian refugees registered with UNRWA, and more than 1.5 million Palestinian refugees are still found in refugee camps on the West Bank, in Gaza, in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Some of them from Syria having become refugees for the third time, and we're still waiting for the right to return. It's quite amazing that it would appear that the question of Palestine and Palestinian refugees have been forgotten during the past few years, not only because of the Syrians and now the Ukrainian refugees, which expose once and for all, in my opinion, the hypocrisy of the West. Nevertheless, this forgotten stuff does not mean that we do not exist. We still exist until today. And although we live like this on the West Bank in Bantustans under apartheid, there's a lot that we are doing in order to resist our situation as refugees and as Palestinians under Israeli military rule and apartheid. Okay, now with education, it is seriously compromised by the chronic war-like conditions, of course, and over 70 years, which the population has endured in a colonized and apartheid mode for over 70 years. This is how our children go to school. You can see the Israeli army watching the children go in and out of the school. You can see the Israeli army searching their bags before they get to school. You can see a student crossing a checkpoint. There's a barricade now, not allowing cars to go in, but allowing individuals and then checking them and letting them in. by the Israeli army. Sometimes the Israeli army builds doors between areas so that you cross when the door is only opened, and it's only opened at certain times, and if you miss it, tough luck, you've lost your day at school and at work. Or you could be crossing and you get a good dose of tear gas, sound bombs, and live bullets. Or, as has happened on the road to Birzeit University, where I teach, a gouged out road with a lot of tear gas where we had to cross. And sometimes we just crossed using a donkey cart. There was no other choice. No cars could go in. At other times, we just walked. And it was very difficult to walk in the winter, certainly very difficult, except that Janine, our employee who has a disability, was so adamant about crossing. There were always shabab, young people, who came in to help her cross by actually carrying her. They just carried Janine to work. Or, for example, in the Gaza Strip, where an UNRWA school, which was thrown with phosphorus bomb at unarmed civilians which were hiding there. Just an example of the exposures. According to the UN, tear gas and other firing weapons injured at least 480 students and teaching staff, and between 2019 and 2021. Explosion weapons affected 305 schools and kindergartens. In May, around a quarter of all Gaza schools were damaged due to air launch or ground launch bombardment. It's unbelievable. It's called collateral damage. That's what it's called. Palestinian East Jerusalem schools have been protesting Israel's attempt to obliterate the Palestinian narrative and history from Palestinian school curricula. And it's a relentless war against the Palestinian educational system in Jerusalem and elsewhere, with attempts to Israelize education among Palestinians from East Jerusalem, given especially that East Jerusalem has been illegally annexed to Israel in violation of the Geneva Convention soon after 1967. However, we are colonized in other ways. We have violations of adolescents and young people at school, for example, go beyond physical violation and harm. It entails other types of harm. On top of psychological harm and chronic exposure to political violence, there is the harm of stigma by some, maybe many, international bodies and press. We have had the experience of international groups coming in to study adolescents and young people and asking us to participate in studies revealing colonial and incorrect approaches to understanding Palestinians, for example, by asking the wrong kind of questions. They ask, for example, how do we stop Palestinian young people from being violent? As if violence is in our genes. Instead of, why do Palestinian adolescent and young people exhibit violence to begin with? They've been chronically violated. So it's a natural reaction. I mean, read Frantz Fanon. Concepts and frameworks are also imposed. For example, trauma. Is Palestinian trauma a medical problem? Do we all need medications and therapies, or is it that our trauma about with exposure to political violence is something that requires its removal? The removal of the causes of suffering will remove the symptoms that we have. Also, when imposed knowledge constantly being talked about in ways that are stigmatizing and simply wrong. Resilience, a concept from engineering, going back to where things were. Is it about going back to where we were? To us, we have the capacity for a lot more than that. We have that capacity to endure and resist, not just accept and adapt. We resist every day of our lives. We resist by teaching, we resist by conducting research and building institutions despite exposure to political violence, sometimes severely. And even if recently more and more international groups supporting research are calling for what is called quote unquote equal partnership with researchers from the South, we continue to find colonial assumptions about knowledge flow. In general, the flow of knowledge is from north to south, but not from the south to the north. Why? But why? Also with research ethics, imposition of knowledge. Why do we set the age of children at 18? Here, at 15, people get married, they start working, etc. They're no longer children, they are adults. So to us, childhood stops at age 15, not at 18. But why are we being forced to accept the notion of children at age 18? It is unacceptable. Why do we need to have participants sign disclosure? And always, people don't like to sign, except for, of course, invasive procedure. But so we don't ask them to sign. We read disclosure and we sign ourselves. And why is the focus on individuals instead of possible harm to communities and entire societies, which is a main issue in Palestine? So how do we deal with this problem? We work to decolonize our knowledge production by conducting research which is relevant and important for community. This is about developing the right research question from the ground up, and then arguing and never stopping arguing with international funders in as much as we can, and explaining the problem in conferences and workshops like this one, where people listen because they understand. And despite warlike conditions, we continue to work at all odds. This is an example of how a gouged out road stopped our car. It made our car get stuck when we were going to field work in the north, and how the Shabab came and helped by unstucking the car, and we just continued with the work. And we continue to sing, and oh, do we sing? I sing, I'm over there, you see, with the men, because they have a lovely, the tenors have a lovely lines. So I sing with the tenors, so we sing and don't stop singing, and enjoy some precious moments despite all odds, and do not ever stop from having hope in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed. Thought that really underlined some of the more general points made by both Mario and Maha earlier. Our next speaker is Ahmad. Is he in the room?
He's from Lebanon.
Oh, he's okay, on screen. Thank you.
مرحبا. بدي أقول لكم شكرا إنه عم كون هون حتى أحكي عن مشاكلي ومشاكل أغلبية الطلاب والسوريين تحديدا. أنا اسمي أحمد سويد، عمري 19 سنة، من سوريا. إذا بدكم تعرفوا منين تحديدا، من حمص. هلا أنا صف 10، متأخر 3 سنين عن خط دراستي، والسبب كان عدم قدرتي على تأمين الأوراق اللازمة لحتى تابع دراستي في الصف اللي بيناسب عمري. هلا هو السبب ضعيف، فراح أرجع أحكي عنه هلا. قدرت أرجع أتعلم بسبب مبادرة صغيرة كان اسمها غرسة، ومن بعدها دخلت مجال التعليم الرسمي. من هون أنا قدرت أتعرف على مفهوم كتير مهم، هو إنه الأفراد بإمكانهم صنع كتير من الإنجازات مهما كانت مواردهم قليلة، وبيقدروا يساعدوا بعضهم في عملية خلق ما هو أجمل وأذكى وما من ما يحصل من بشاعة على أرض الواقع. وأنا هلأ عم أعمل هذا الشيء مع مجموعة من الشباب، وسوا عم نخلق مبادرة بتقوم على الاستفادة من الموارد المحلية. Okay. مش it's okay.
Good. Interpretation. Yeah. English. There we go.
Thank you, sir.
اوكي عيد. اوكي. وانا هلا عم اعمل هذا الشيء مع مجموعه من الشباب، وسوا عم نخلق مبادره بتقوم على الاستفاده من الموارد المحليه الموجوده بين الايادي مهما كانت ضئيله، لحتى نصنع مساحات بتشتغل على تعليم الاطفال المهملين على القراءه والكتابه. ما بيقتصر الامر على الاطفال بس، على كل فرد مهما بلغ من العمر. بدي نقل شوي اذا بتسمحوا لي وخبركم عن تجربه العيش بلبنان. يرهق الحديث عن عن موضوع حياه اللاجئين السوريين في لبنان، من إجهاد وعناء وصعوبة ومعاناة في بلد أصلاً غاطس بالمشقة. لكن أنا مهتم بالتدريس والتعليم بطريقة جدية ومناضلة، بالأخص تعليم الأطفال السوريين كما المراهقين، يلي هو مهمش مكبل بالضائقة والصعوبة. الدراسة هي من الأسس الجوهرية والأساسية لأسباب عادية أبرزها القضاء على الجهل للتمكن من مواكبة التطور الذي يحصل في العالم. بدكم خبركم عن معاناة أو بالأحرى المطالب المستحيلة اللي بتعيق الطلاب كلاجئين من متابعة الدراسة تبعهم. طب اسمعوا، يطلب من كل طالب من اللاجئ السوري أن يحضر من سوريا أوراق تثبت المستوى التعليمي يلي وصل له لحتى يقدر يسجل بالمدرسة. هون كأنه عم يطلبوا منا نرجع على مدرستنا القديمة بسوريا اللي صارت التراب تحت القصف وأشياء صادمة ما بدي فوت فيها، ونطلب الأوراق من مدير غير موجود أساساً. بعد ما نخلص من كل هالمشاكل والتسجيل منفوت بحالة ارتجاج أو خبطة إذا بدكم، من معاملة رديئة، تمييز عنصري، سلوك محبط كتير، وإهانات صادمة. كنت أنا هون بالصف الرابع وشاهد على هالتصرف الغير مقبول أبداً. غير انه الدوام المسائي يلي ملزمين فيه اكثر دليل على انه التلميذ يحس حاله ما دون الدونيه السفلى، وكمان الاهتمام صفر فينا وبالمنهج يلي لازم يتبعوه. بنوصل للصف التاسع ونحن عم نلهت، واصلا بيكون تقريبا 70% من الطلاب تركوا المدرسه بسبب صعوبه تامين وراء هذا الصف. لحتى تقدر تسجل بهذا الصف مطلوب كثير اشياء. منا بينطلب منا 3 اوراق اساسيه يلي هن جواز السفر واقامه واخراج قيد مصدق من سوريا. طب اولا جواز السفر تكلفته رقم خيالي بالنسبه لي وللكل طبعا، يلي هو $825. ثانيا اخراج القيد يلي بنجيبه من سوريا، وبعد ما يوصل لهون تروح لتصدقه بالسفاره بتلاقيه مش مصدق من سوريا اصلا او خلصانه صلاحيته. ثالثا الإقامة يلي مستحيل أنا كأحمد سويد أنه أقدر أعمله بلبنان، لأنه بسهولة في مرة من المرات قمت لحتى أعمل إقامة بالأمن العام طلبوا مني جواز سفر. أوكي تمام، قلت أنه يلا جواز سفر ومن سفارة بلدي ويلا ممكن أعمله يعني. رحت على السفارة ولا بنصدم أنه أول طلب طلبوه مني أنه بدهم إقامة. ف تلاقي أنه مثل دويرة، بدك إقامة لتعمل جواز سفر وبدك جواز سفر لتعمل إقامة. الإقامة هي اللي غالباً بتخلص بنص السنة الدراسية، وهون بتصير عم تركض لحتى تلحق تجددها وتقدم وراءك قبل ما يروح عليك الامتحان وتعيد السنة. في سؤال إنه هل أنا مع التعليم الدامج؟ بالوقت الحالي مثل ما كلنا بنعرف إنه التعليم مثل ما هو هلأ صار صعب وسيء على اللبناني والسوري. كلنا شفنا بالسنين الأخيرة صار في ضغط على التعليم الرسمي اللبناني، التعليم الحكومي، بسبب الأزمة الاقتصادية اللي عم يمر فيها البلد، وإنه كثير من الطلاب اللبنانيين نقلوا من المدارس الخاصة على المدارس الحكومية. ضيفوا عليهم مشاكل الإضرابات، إضرابات الأساتذة من وراء عجز وزارة التربية عن إنه تغطي راتبهم، وهذا عم يسبب عطل كثير، وهذا سيء كمان للطلاب اللبنانيين والسوريين. بس إيه، أنا مع إنه يكون في دمج للطلاب من كل الجنسيات بالتعليم. وبعد مرور 11 سنة من اللجوء السوري، معلش نحن كنا بنشبه بعض وبنحب بعض، مش لازم يكون في فصل على أساس عنصري، لأنه ما في تفسير ثاني برأيي غير هيك. تعالوا ندمج داخل دوام واحد، ليش لا؟ هذا الشيء بيخفف نزاعات ويخفف عنصرية وبيزيد اندماج الناس مع بعض البعض ابتداء من السنوات الأولى لعمرهم، وبنتعلم من ثقافات بعض، شيء حلو. تعالوا نحب بعض ونتحمل بعض. أنا أكيد من ضرورة إنه تكون طرق التعليم تراعي تواجد كل الجنسيات سوا، وكمان الأساتذة اللي بيلعبوا دور كتير قوي يكونوا مدربين على تنظيم الاختلاف بين الطلاب، والأهم شو؟ معاملة الجميع بالتساوي مثل بعض. يعني التعليم مثل ما هو هلا سيء للكل، للسوري واللبناني سوا. من الضروري انه يتحسن، والا رح تدخل اجيال من اللبنانيين وكل الجنسيات بدوام من الضياع والفساد بسبب فقر الناس والازمه اللي عم تنعكس على النظام التعليمي بلبنان وعم تتسبب انهياره، وهو اصلا هلا بحاله انهيار. حاليا كل الطلاب مندرجه بالمدارس الرسميه، بس هن عمليا مش عم يتعلموا. او انا بشوف انه بلبنان التعليم للسوريين هو بس ليتعلموا القراءه والكتابه فقط. لو صارت إلي فرصة أرجع أصمم كل شيء، عندي كتير أفكار لهالشيء. إنه مثلا لو كنا عم نحكي عن تعليم دامج أو منفصل في ظل الأزمة المستمرة، كنت بفكر نعمل شيء كتير إبداعي بيحول التعليم لتعليم المواد الأساسية، والاعتماد على تشجيع الطالب على التعليم الذاتي. كيف؟ يعني دفع الطالب على قراءة الكتب بالبيت، وهذا الشيء بيبني ثقافة ومعرفة واسعة. وبالمدرسة بس الأساتذة بيصوبوا ويوجهوا شو تعلم الطالب من هالكتب مع مناقشة وحوار. وكمان الاعتماد على أنشطة نفسية اجتماعية يلي تزيد من الثقة والصواب في التفكير عند الطلاب، وبتساعدهم ينخرطوا بالمجتمع وبيتقبلوا الآخر. وكنت بفكر أكثر يندعم التعليم المهني، لأنه التعليم الرسمي بشكله الحالي ما بينسجم مع وضع البلد ومع وضع السوريين بالبلد أبداً. يعني ما فينا نفوت جامعات، ما فينا نشتغل بشهادتنا. بظن انه فيها المدارس المهنيه تعلمنا نحلم احلام نقدر نحققها. اما اذا بدي يغير بالتعليم الرسمي بوضعه الحالي، فالمشاكل اللي قلتها بالاول ما بعرف اذا انتبهتوا لها، انه بتسهل انه تسهيل الاستمرار بالتعليم عن طريق فصل التعليم عن فكره الاقامات، او على الاقل عن فكره اقامات الاهل. وحتى لو كان التعليم بلبنان بيعطي الأطفال السوريين القدرة على القراءة والكتابة بس، فهذا لحاله لازم يستمر، لأنه القراءة والكتابة هي من أبسط حقوق الإنسان، وقادر نوعا ما تحميه من الاستغلال والضياع في الشارع، وقادرة تخليه بيوم من الأيام إذا بده يتعلم شيء جديد يرجع يستأنف تعليمه. إنه إذا التعليم الرسمي بس بيعلم القراءة والكتابة وعم تنصرف عليه آلاف وملايين الدولارات، فأنا بدون مصاري وبدون دعم وبس بدعم المجتمع اللي حوالي، مثل أمي ومنظمة اسمها غرسة، هي نفسها اللي طلعتني من أنه أكون بالمخيم لطالب، وبعض الناشطات اللي قدرت بمساعدتهم أنه علم طلاب كتار القراءة والكتابة من دون تكاليف. وحبيت كتير شو عم أعمل، لأنه عم بعمله من قلبي هذا، لأنه نحن جيل ما بدنا نموت مع البلاد، نحن بدنا نعملها، بدنا نعيش ونعمل لها التنفس الاصطناعي لهالبلد. ليه ما بتقوم الدولة بدعم مبادرات بسيطة، أو بتعرفوا أنسوا الدولة شوي بخصوص حقوق الإنسان؟ لازم يكون في جمعيات داعمة لفكرة إنه اللي مثلي وغيري كتار يعلموا الصغار بكلفة جد بسيطة، أبو مسطرة ومحاي وصف صغير. كلفة قليلة وضئيلة جدا قادرة تقوم بهالمهمة الكبيرة. لو بدها تعملها مؤسسات كبيرة فبتحتاج لكلف كتير عالية. أنا هيك بقول دائما بالأزمات الكبيرة من الأساسي دعم موارد الناس حتى تحل مشاكل بعضها البعض. لما بتغيب الدولة ما حدا قادر يحل محلها غير الناس. رح أختم بأنه مثل ما قلت التعليم هو جوهري، والتعليم بشكله الحالي وضمن قوانين البلد هو ما له أفق أبدا أبدا. ما بحقق لنا غير أنه نقدر نقرأ ونكتب وبس. وبالرغم من أهمية أسس التعليم اللي همي إنه نكتب ونقرأ، نحن جيل طموح إنه نعمر ونوصل لمحلات بعيدة غير المكان اللي مزروكين فيه هلا. وإذا الدولة ثواني بس صداقات وعلاقات، أو إذا الدولة مو قادرة تعمله نحن رح نعمله، ورح نضل نجرب، لأن هذا حقنا وحق كل طفل. ومثل هي المبادرات اللي قامت او المدارس فينا نقول كمان فرصه للطالب انه ما يعيشوا بالشارع، وانه يربوا صداقات وعلاقات ويعيشوا تجارب ويفرحوا مع بعضهم البعض، والشارع هو اللي بيعرضهم بكل الوقت لانواع عديده من الاستغلال وحياه ضئيله وتجارب صادمه بتستمر معهم مدى الحياه. أنا المدرسة هي اللي خلتني أعمل رفقات وأعيش مع الأولاد وأضحك معهم وحبهم ويحبوني وأعرفهم وأعرف بلدهم أكثر وأعرف بلدي وأتعلم شوي عن الحياة بشكل شوي طبيعي وأقل عنف وأكثر فرح، ونعرف نميز الصح من الغلط ونختار دائما الصح. الأطفال تعرف تفرح مع بعضها البعض مهما كان الجو اللي حواليهم سيء. شكرا.
Thanks very much indeed, Ahmad. Okay, thanks very much. Some really valuable insights there, and thanks also to the interpreter for great translation. Our final panelist today is Elaine from UCL. You've got the very challenging task of giving us some thoughts on what we've heard in the last hour or so. If you could stick to 5 or 7 minutes, that would be really much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks very much. The last hour has been so moving and the papers have been so immensely important. I'm almost silenced by my kind of beating heart at what I've heard, but I wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to be the respondent here and to try to frame what I've heard. Academically, which is hard, but I'm going to try. Okay. The field that this work contributes to, education and international development, is an odd field, as you've heard. It's had different political histories. And what the work we are hearing here is disruptive in the very best sense, because it's presenting some very, very significant intellectual challenges. I think what we heard from Maha was this incisive analysis of the unjust politics that frames the field of scholarship and the kind of discursive constructions. Mario gave us a critical history of the field of scholarship, and he talked about the diversity of perspectives that we need to appreciate. Rita powerfully evoked the education facets of generations of Palestinians' experiences of being subjected to attack, dispossession, harm, injustice, and resistance. And what we've just heard from Ahmad is this incredible wish for life, wish for education, demands, and the injustices, that kind of trappedness by documentation, the trappedness by the state, and the ways in which he's being failed and yet demanding to go forward. So I had 3 themes that I wanted to talk about. The first was about time. The second was about the way in which that we needed to attend to the needs of individuals and think about these differently in relation to state. And the third is what Carl White distills as epistemologies of coordination, which I want to link to something about solidarity, because I think what this field needs, and I think it was said in the initial presentations, but it's articulated so clearly in each of the presentations, is this strong ethical moral compass. It's the papers express this, and I think the center and the research project it's going to lead is going to be the most enormous valuable contribution to enhancing that moral compass. So here are just 3 points about academic hooks, maybe, to hang the discussion on. What we heard is two kinds of presentations of time. On the one hand, there's the institutional version of time, which I think Mario and Maha presented to us both very incisive critical accounts. And then what we had from Rita and Ahmad was this very strong evocation of personal time and how these disjunctions of time, so that the work on education and international development has usually said it's the former that we must look at. But it's actually how do we hold together these two perspectives on times, the emotionally lived time as well as the institutionally critiqued time. And there's a lot of words that I've written about that, but I'm just throwing out that set of issues. The second issue is I think this field of inquiry unsettles the categories about thinking about education systems linked to the state. As the detailed descriptions from Lebanon and Maria's account of the US in Afghanistan showed us, we can't just privilege the needs of the state without looking at the needs of individuals. And these diverse individuals and the unjust conditions in which they live have to be centered in any kind of analysis. And the third issue that I wanted to raise was about the epistemology of coordination and solidarity. I think solidarity often, well, it's under-theorized, and the ideas about it often get made apolitical in the way Maha suggested, as kinds of partnerships or linked to the kind of rule-bound ecologies of multilateral institutions. But we need to think about solidarities as understanding common and different responsibilities in this field of education and conflict and experience. And we need to theorize it better. We need empirical work that says what happens when Ahmad says at the end, I want to live, and this is how I want to do it. We need to document that. So in concluding, I want to draw out points that I think are implicit in all the presentations, but I just want to underline them. The scale and depth and seriousness of the current conflicts can't be underestimated, and that's why the center is so important. But I think the other thing that we can't and always will hang on to is that flower of hope in Rita's, that concluded Rita's final presentation, that cry from the heart from Ahmad, I want to live. And the field has to be about hope, and it has to be about making that really concrete and real. And good luck to you in doing it. And really, I look forward to a very rich discussion.